Matthew chapter 7. That's where we're going to begin in our study tonight. If you ask people what is the most well-known verse in the Bible, probably what you get is John 3:16. That's kind of the one that most people would say. Well, most people have heard John 3:16. Even if they don't know what it says, they've seen it on a billboard, on a t-shirt. I don't think this happens anymore, but you remember in the old days football games, whenever somebody kicked extra point, there'd always be a guy in the end zone holding a John 3:16 sign. And so there's a lot of room to make that argument, but I think if you really want to know what is the most well-known verse in the Bible, it's Matthew 7 and verse 1, "Judge not, that you be not judged." People who've never even opened the Bible, who don't really know much about Christianity at all, they know somewhere in that Jesus book it says something about don't judge people, and they like that. Don't judge me. And, that's technically what the text says, but that's not exactly what Jesus is saying. And we're going to look a little bit about that tonight. Before we did that, I wanted to mention that one of the hardest things to maintain in life is balance. It's just so easy for us to drift into extremes. I'm not just talking about in our faith. I'm talking about in everything. With our health, sometimes people say, you know what, doctor says I need to exercise and get in better health. And then sometimes you'll see people begin that, and then sometimes you see people become obsessed with health and exercise, which can come with its own set of unique problems. And maybe somebody takes up a new hobby or a new recreation or something, and at first it's just kind of fun, and then the next thing you know, you see it begin to just take over their lives. And balance is hard for us as humans to maintain. And by balance, I'm trying to define balance this way: by keeping things in their proper perspective, not ignoring or neglecting them, and not becoming obsessed and overly emphasizing things, but making sure they keep their proper order in place in our lives. And I would say that's true of this text more than anything. There are two extremes that people tend to want to go to when it comes to the subject of judging. One extreme is this: don't judge anybody. That the only thing that is wrong is to say that something is wrong. If you render any kind of judgment, pass any kind of judgment, that's bad and that's wrong, and you shouldn't do that. And who are you to judge me? And only God can judge me. And judge not, that you be not judged. And that's an extreme position that some folks find themselves in. Well, I'm just never going to render judgment, never going to say that something's bad or wrong, or you shouldn't do it, or you need to change. Then there's another extreme, which just as many of us struggle with as the other, I think. And that is to being hypercritical in our judgment. And being critical of everything and over-examining everything that people do and say, and maybe even drifting into the realm of judgment in areas that really are none of our business or none of our concern. Sometimes we feel that we need to have our say. We live in a culture now that actually not just encourages it, but then provides us with the vehicles to do that. Really, at the end of the day, that's what social media has become, is the ability for me to publicize broadly what I think about everything. And we've jumped in with both feet as Americans, as humans. I guess really everybody does it around the world, but both of those are dangerous extremes we need to be careful about. We need to be careful that we never render judgment. But first of all, nobody wants to live in the world where there is no judgment. Nobody wants to live in that world, because that world would be a world without law enforcement, for example. And anybody could do anything that they wanted to you, to your family, people that you love, and there would be no way to say, no, you can't do that, that's wrong. You can't do that. You're not supposed to do that. Hey, man, we're not supposed to judge. Don't judge what I'm doing. You can't say that what I'm doing is wrong. Who says so? Well, we have standards by which our community is governed, and we're thankful for those. Now, at the same time, we don't want to live in a society where there is an overreach of that. You don't like the government telling you what you have to do about your health care, do you? You don't like the government telling you how many guns you can own or what kind of guns you can own, do you? See, there's this weird balance that we have to strive for. We need some oversight where we say, look, this is wrong, and no, you're not going to be allowed to do that. But at the same time, we don't want it to go too extreme where you're getting into every facet of my life and saying, okay, this is how you do that. You remember hearing the stories about in New York City where they restricted the size of soft drink that you could purchase? Did you think, okay, that's a little silly, all right? I don't need you judging that deeply in my life. Again, balance is tricky. Balance is tricky. Generally speaking, I don't think that Christian people struggle with never passing judgment. Now, I would say that maybe in recent years that movement has come to take over more and more, where even Christians are being told, hey, you're not supposed to judge people, and your own book says it. I would say that historically the reputation that Christians have is that we judge too much, that we stick our nose in too many people's business. And so what we're going to be looking at in Matthew 7 is hopefully meant to help us have a little bit of balance. By the way, everybody knows Matthew 7:1. I always like to ask that people, do you know what John 7:24 says? Because the same guy who said, judge not, that you be not judged, also said in John 7:24, judge righteous judgment. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. So the same man that said don't judge also said to judge. So obviously, it's not a blanket condemnation of judgment, but it's an understanding about the place that judgment should have in our lives. And I'll go ahead and spoil the ending of the sermon at the beginning. God wants the majority of your judgment to be on yourself. He wants the emphasis, the greater weight of rendering judgment being you looking in the mirror and casting judgment on who you see in the mirror. Now, that doesn't mean God says don't judge anyone ever about anything. I didn't say that. That's an extreme position. Only that the greater weight of our judgment should be on ourselves, not on other people. It's when we spend too much time judging others and not enough judging self that we start to get out of balance. So let's walk through Matthew 7 for just a minute. Judge not, that you be not judged. Now, if the text stopped right there, it'd be pretty cut and dry. But Jesus only uses that as an introductory statement. And what we're going to find out is it's not just blanketly judgment that he's condemning, but a certain type of judgment. And we're going to see what he's speaking about is hypocritical judgment. It's when you're criticizing someone for something that is lesser of an offense than what you yourself are guilty of. And rather than worrying about what's going on in your own life, you're more concerned about what they need to be doing. And he's going to use these two terms. We're probably not familiar with them, at least the mote and the beam. The beam, Jesus is using a little bit of hyperbole. He's exaggerating on purpose. The beam here refers to something like we think of as a telephone pole or maybe a fence post. And it's meant to be ridiculous because obviously you can't have a fence post sticking out of your eye. But it's meant to be exaggerated for a purpose. Now on the flip side of that is we have the mote, which we might say something along the lines of a speck or a fleck of sawdust or something like that. You know, it's just a little something, okay? And if you got a choice between a speck of sawdust in your eye and a fence post in your eye, always go with the speck of sawdust, okay? That's always the better option. So he says, you need to understand, when you're rendering judgment, that it's like a boomerang. You know, you throw a boomerang and what happens? It comes back to you, or at least it's supposed to. What's the old expression? If I point my finger at you, I got three more that are pointing right back at me. And that's the point that Jesus is making, is you have to understand, whatever standard that you're using to render judgment on another person, you need to know that same standard of judgment is going to be returned on you. When you go to Home Depot and you want to buy wood and they sell it by the foot, listen, you're both using the same tape measure, okay? Now, even though it's technically not true, a 2x4 is actually not 2x4, is it? It's actually a little bit less than that. It's kind of a rounded off. But we understand that they're using the same tape measure. They're using the same definition of a foot that you are. And that's 12 inches. And you can take a tape measure, you can hook it on it and run it down and say, okay, it's 8 feet long. Now, if you're paying by the foot, you might say, no, that's actually 4 feet. That's 4 feet long. And the guy who's selling it, he's going to want to say, no, that's not 8 feet. That's 12 feet. Well, there's a way to solve that, isn't it? You take a standard of measurement, tape measure, you put it on it, and it'll tell you how long it is. Jesus says, whatever standard of judgment you're applying on someone else, you need to know that same standard is going to be turned right back on you. The King James says it the second way this, with what measure you meet, it shall be measured unto you. And he kind of goes from using what we might think of as measuring distance to measuring weight there. Same thing if you go to a grocery store and you're buying a pound of apples. There's a standard, there's a scale, 16 ounces, and it's going to be weighed in that. And that's going to decide. He says, listen, the same standard goes for everybody. Now, after he said that in verses 1 and 2, notice what he says next. Why do you behold the mote that is in your brother's eye, but consider not the beam that is in your own eye? Now we're starting to see where the problem's coming in. The problem is not judgment. The problem isn't even the standard of judgment. The problem is this. All you can see is the mote in your brother's eye, but you are paying no attention to the beam in your own eye. This is where the problem in Matthew 7 comes into play. Why are you observing the mote in your brother's eye, but you do not consider the beam in your own eye? Or how will you say to your brother, here, let me pull out the mote from your eye when you have a beam in your own eye? When I went to the dentist the other day, I got to meet the guy. He's actually an orthopedic surgeon. And if you don't think there's a difference, you call him a dentist and you'll find out real quick. They'll correct you. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. They take that stuff kind of serious. And he came in there and he was explaining and walking through, telling me step by step everything he was going to do to remove this tooth. And you know what I found myself looking at? His teeth. By the way, they were perfect. They looked great, man. Now, if he'd come in there snaggle tooth and gap tooth and rotted out teeth, you think I'm going to let that guy get in my mouth and start digging in there? No way, buddy. Listen, don't trust the dentist that ain't got teeth. Don't trust the barber that's bald. And don't trust the skinny cook. I'm just telling you. That means they don't eat their own stuff. Jesus is saying, listen, it makes no sense that you're going to say to your brother, hey, let me get in there and do some optical surgery on you to remove this speck while you've got this great big obstruction in your own eye. Now here's the important part of the text. The next thing he says, after he says, you hypocrite, because that's what it is, it's hypocrisy to do that. First, remove the beam from your own eye. Then you can see clearly to remove the mote from your brother's eye. Jesus does not say, do not be concerned about sin in other people. He does not say that. What Jesus says is, first, be concerned about the egregious sin in your own life. Deal with that. Then you're in a position to be able to worry about sin in somebody else's life. It's not an either or kind of thing. It's a first then kind of thing. First, clean up your own yard. Then you can start looking at your neighbor's yard. If you've ever flown on an airplane, you know that one of the things that they tell you when they're giving that big safety speech at the beginning is they say, in the event that the cabin were to lose pressure, which, by the way, that's a bad thing. You don't want that to happen. You might not think about it, but hey, if you're 30,000 feet in the air, there's not a whole lot of oxygen 30,000 feet above our head, and we need a lot of oxygen for these things to work. And if you lose pressure, then all of a sudden you're up 30,000 feet in the air and you don't have oxygen. And it doesn't take very long. Literally, it takes a matter of seconds before you will black out because your brain's got to have oxygen. and you'll black out. And so they tell you, in the event that this cabin loses pressure, first thing that's going to happen is these little oxygen masks are going to deploy from the thing above you. And when that happens, this is what they'll tell you, without exception, no matter who you have with you, no matter what their state is, it could be your infant, it could be your 2-year-old, it could be your 90-year-old grandmother, it doesn't matter. The first thing you need to do is put that oxygen mask on yourself, pull it tight, and make sure that you're able to breathe. Now, your instinct might be like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm a parent. My first instinct is always to protect my child, to take care of my child. And so, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure my little one, that they've got their oxygen mask, or my spouse, I'm going to make sure that they've got it. But there's a reason why they tell you don't do that. Because you might have just seconds before you black out. And if you black out, you can't help them. So the first thing you need to do is make sure that you're in a position that you're going to be able to help other people. And that means in this instance, you need to take care of yourself first. Then you can start taking care of the people around you. That's the message of Matthew chapter 7. The message is, hey, it's not every man for himself. You know, I'm just going to leave you to the Lord, and that's going to be between you and Him. First of all, churches don't have that luxury. We talked this morning about one of the reasons why we love the church. We talked about the community, the fellowship, the love. We could have just as easily talked about that there's also a responsibility and accountability to a family. When I was growing up in my mom and dad's house, I had certain freedoms to do what I wanted to, but there were also certain responsibilities and expectations that fell on me. And if I did not meet those responsibilities, there were repercussions. Or if I behaved in a way that was unacceptable in my father's house, there were certain consequences that came with that. I was held accountable because my actions affect other people, not just me. So it's never the case that God says, well, you just look to your brother and say, hey, that's between you and the Lord. I'm not going to worry about your sin. What Matthew 7 says is, first, make sure that you've dealt with yours. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean that you've got to be sinless. If that were the case, we could never render any judgment at all. Only the Lord could do it. And when it comes to final judgment, only the Lord will render that judgment, because only He knows the thoughts and intents of the heart. Only He knows what's inside a man. All we can judge is based upon the evidence we have. The Lord can cut through all of that and see what's really going on, and He'll render that judgment. But right now, He says, first, remove the beam from your eye. Take care of yourself spiritually. Then you'll be in a position to help somebody else. Now, what does that look like? What that looks like is Galatians chapter 6. So that's where we're going to finish out tonight. Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 shows us what this text looks like when it's carried out properly. As Paul begins to end that letter, he says this: Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault. We need to talk a little bit about that phrase, overtaken in a fault. We're not just talking about a mistake. We're not just talking about a slip. We're not just talking about, this is just some little thing. Hey, I messed up. I realize that, and I'm gonna make things right and move on. Overtaken in a fault calls to mind the imagery of 2 Peter chapter 2. Verse number 20, Peter talks about those who have escaped the pollution of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. If you want a real good picture of what it means to be saved, that's a pretty good description. You've escaped the pollution of the world. How'd you escape it? Through the knowledge of Jesus Christ. But he cautions, some of those people, he says, are again entangled therein. What is therein refer to? What are they entangled in? The pollution of the world that they had escaped. They're again entangled therein, and listen what he says, and they're overcome. And the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. I think when Paul says, brothers, if a man be overtaken in a fault, I think he's talking about the same thing that Peter's talking about. We're not talking about somebody, again, who just, all right, I messed up and I realize that I've messed up and I'm taking the steps to make things right. No, this is someone who is becoming entangled in sin again. So what is my responsibility? Judge not, that you be not judged? No, that's not the responsibility. The assumption is going to be that first I've removed the beam from my own eye, so I'm not a hypocrite. And now I'm in a position to look at the mote that's in my brother's eye. And he says, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, seek to restore that man. Seek to restore such a one. Now, what does it mean to be spiritual? Generally speaking, when you talk about spiritual in the King James Version, it's most often put in contrast against carnal. Paul does it a lot in the book of Romans. Talks about the spiritual versus the carnal, or the spirit-minded versus the fleshly. That's kind of how it's portrayed in the book of Galatians, because just right before Paul says what he says in Galatians 6:1, he's just talked about how we should not walk according to the flesh. And then he lists the works of the flesh. He says, now the works of the flesh are manifest in these things. And he describes these things. And he says, but what I'm calling you to instead is to walk in the Spirit. And then he says, and here's what the fruit of the Spirit is. And we know what that is. So what I'm going to suggest to you is in that context, when Paul says, those of you who are spiritual, he's speaking to those who are walking in the Spirit and not walking in the flesh. If you want to use John's language, those who are walking in the light and not walking in darkness. That's 1 John 1. If you want to use Paul's language from Romans, it's the fleshly and carnal versus the spiritual. And in Romans chapter 12, he talks about how we are to be holy, to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. If you're using the King James Version, it says, which is your reasonable service. Now, if you're using American Standard Version, which tends to be a more literal word-for-word type of translation, even in the King James, it says, which is your spiritual service. And so I think maybe a good working definition, if we want to know what that really looks like to be spiritual, because if you ask people on the street, what does it mean to be spiritual, you're going to get every kind of answer you can ever think of. Spiritual is when you turn the lights down and you hum. That's what makes it spiritual. Or what? Listen, I think we get a clear definition in Romans 12. Holy and acceptable to God. That's what it means to be spiritually minded. That's what it means to walk after the Spirit. That's what it means to walk in the light. It doesn't mean to be sinlessly perfect, but it does mean that you are holy and that you're living a life that is pleasing to God. And he says, those of you who fit that description, seek to restore the one that's overtaken in the fault. In other words, he tells you, you need to be passing some judgment on your brother. You need to judge that your brother is in sin and that he needs help getting out of it. And because you're spiritually minded, seek to restore him. The word restore is a medical term that refers to setting a broken bone. And you know what? It hurts when you set a broken bone. You got to cause pain to prevent greater pain. The bone is broken. You got to put it back like it was supposed to be, and then it can heal in time. And he says, and your brother has become broken again in sin, and he's going to be overcome in it, and he's ultimately going to be destroyed by it. That's why those who are spiritually minded, those who have removed the beam from their own eye, can now see clearly and can help their brother to set things right again so that he can begin to heal. And he says, now as you do it, check yourself. Seek to restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. You want to know how to maintain balance in judgment? I think Matthew 7 and Galatians 6 tells you how to do it. On the one hand, it's not never judging anybody for anything. And on the other hand, it's not judging folks for everything constantly and being so worried about them that you never have time to worry about your own sin. First, remove the beam from your eye. Then you're in a position to be able to help your brother or sister in any sin that they found themselves overtaken in. Make sure that you're living in a holy and acceptable way. Make sure that you are living a spiritual life so that you can help restore them. And even as you do it, Be careful and consider yourself. Don't get caught up in thinking you're better. Don't get caught up thinking that you would never. Don't get caught up in thinking, I can't believe. Look, consider yourself. And just kind of repeat that phrase. I don't think it's a biblical phrase. And when I say biblical, I don't think it's actually, there's a verse for it, but it's a biblical concept there. But for the grace of God go I. It's just the old reminder that, you know what? I might be the one that's needing somebody to pull me out of the ditch one day. So handle with care when you do so. We extend the invitation at the end of every sermon for this very reason. Not to say, hey, come down here at front so we can hear what you've done. Not come down here at front so that we can all look down our nose and make us feel better about ourselves. But no, to say, look, we've all been there. We've all found ourselves humbled at the foot of the cross, asking for forgiveness and mercy, and we've all found it. And so we'll meet you there, and we'll help you there. And so maybe tonight, maybe you need to come to Christ. Maybe you need to remove a beam from your own eye. Maybe you need help getting untangled in sin. Or maybe for the first time you need to become a child of God through faith, repentance, confession, and baptism. Whatever the need is, we're going to sing this song together. If you'll just come forward while we stand and sing it.
There's a fountain